Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series, Israel Insider. My name is Anaf Kalam, and I will be moderating today's discussion. We are pleased to be joined today by Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, who joins us each week to give us a brief overview of the top events currently going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will speak for 15 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A from the audience. If you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Akhnaf, and good evening from Israel. The big question, at least on a global scale relating to Israel, because there's a lot of other things going on here in Israel, is the ceasefire holding? And if so, for how long? At the moment, we seem to be in this sort of holding pattern. There's not a ceasefire negotiations. There's no deal. There's nothing actually happening on the ground as far as returning of hostages or releasing Palestinian prisoners or anything like that. But there's really no negotiations either. It's clear that Israel doesn't want to start phase 2 negotiations. Israel did introduce, or at least accept, what's been called the Witkoff proposal, where basically there would be an extension of phase 1 of the ceasefire throughout the Ramadan and I think it's Pesach, up until Pesach, which is at least another 5-6 weeks away. The ceasefire would hold. At the beginning of the ceasefire, half of the hostages still remaining, the living and the dead, would be released, and then the rest would be released on the final day of the ceasefire, or the extension of the ceasefire. Clearly, knowing that that's unlikely to happen without any significant movement on the negotiations, but that's really a non-starter. Hamas aren't prepared to talk about that. Hamas have one goal, and that is to get to the end of the war, to get to a point where Israel is out of the Gaza Strip. They probably will still try and hold onto some of the hostages, knowing that Israel could conceivably just go back to war the day after. So it's really, it's a game of chicken at the moment, and probably what these Witkoff proposals are trying to do is trying to get at least some of the remaining hostages out. The more you get out, the better it is, obviously. But at the moment, there really are no serious negotiations, not on the Israeli side, not on the Hamas side, not even from the US side. There seems to be no real desire, because there's no real pressure on either side, despite the fact that Israel has, as of I think yesterday or the day before, decided to stop all humanitarian aid coming into the Strip. There's even talk of stopping electricity and water, but that hasn't happened, and probably that won't happen. But sometimes just the mere mention of it could conceivably create some pressure. But at the moment, the lack of humanitarian aid, or aid coming in at all, isn't really a problem for Hamas. They've made a lot of money out of the humanitarian aid that's come in throughout the ceasefire. They've made millions. As we know, they appropriate pretty much, if not all, most of the humanitarian aid, and then they make their money by selling it to the residents. Where it will have an effect, especially during the Muslim holy month of Ramadan, is that the prices in the markets in Hamas will rise, and we've already seen them rise. So this will lead to some discontent, but Hamas are trying very hard to keep an eye on that. They've sent out patrols of Hamas officials to try and keep the prices down, to make sure that no one is trying to take advantage of the situation in the markets, in the shops, in the malls. We saw a picture of a mall in Gaza the other day, which was quite a shock for many people. But at the moment, it's not really a major pressure point. Witkoff himself was supposed to arrive in the region. There was many sort of full starts. Apparently, in the last hour, he did meet with a delegation of released hostages in the White House, and they're still waiting to see whether they will get an audience directly with President Trump. Let's not forget, Witkoff is also now involved in very nascent talks between Russia, or maybe not talks between Russia and Ukraine, but at least talks on possibly stopping that war. So he has quite a lot on his plate at the moment. He doesn't want to come to the region, waste time, and nothing seems to be moving. According to official sources, he's waiting for some flexibility from Hamas. That doesn't seem to be coming, so he's probably not coming for the foreseeable future. Where the US has dropped a bombshell in the last day is the release of details concerning direct talks between US and Hamas. And let's not forget that Hamas is a designated terrorist organization in the US, and no US official is allowed to speak to Hamas. But there is a special exemption for Trump's hostage envoy, Adam Bola, who is apparently speaking to Hamas officials in Doha, in Qatar. And they're speaking about ostensibly the release specifically of dual citizens, those Israelis who also have American citizenship. The only live hostage that we know about who has American citizenship is Eden Alexander. There are the bodies of 4 others who have been confirmed dead by Israel, still being held by Hamas. So that is ostensibly the remit. There is a bit of a debate whether there is a wider remit, whether he has, Adam Bola, whether he has been given a green light to discuss wider issues with Hamas concerning the ceasefire, concerning the release of other hostages, but it's not exactly clear. The question that some are asking is whether this caught Israel by surprise, whether Israel was intimately involved, whether they were updated. It doesn't seem that they were completely updated in every single detail in the timing. Israel has said that it was aware of the US's intention to reach out to Hamas. I'm sure it was not particularly happy about it, and I'm sure probably it hasn't been kept abreast of every single detail. This could put a spanner in the works for Israel, because there's been a lot of talk over the last few days that the current situation, that sort of vacuum, as I talked about, with no official ceasefire but no return to war, Israeli officialdom at all sorts of high government levels have said that this can only last for a number of days. It can't go on forever, because Hamas basically get what they want. They remain in the Strip, both on a government level, a governance level, I should say, and on a military level. They're still very much in control. Israel hasn't achieved any of its goals at this point if the situation goes on for too much longer. So there is at least public willingness or intention to go back to war within a few days if Hamas do not move. Alongside this, again, it could be just as a signal, or it could be something very real. 400,000 reservists in Israel have been called up. And let's not forget, many, if not all of these 400 reservists are people who've been serving for the last year and 3-4 months. So they're very tired, they're very battle worn. And once again, they're being called up to serve their country and probably go back to Gaza, because it doesn't seem like there's anything really going on except defensive positions in Syria and Lebanon. On the issue of the IDF, today was the end of an era. It was the end of the Herzi Halevi as Chief of Staff of the IDF era. Today, he was replaced officially by Eyal Zamir, who is very much Prime Minister Netanyahu's choice. He made a point during the ceremonial turnover today, Netanyahu, saying twice, I tried to get Zamir this position, and this is the 3rd time, and I was successful. The question that a lot of commentators are asking is, yes, we do know that Eyal Zamir is close to Netanyahu. He was the Director General up until recently of the Defense Ministry, which obviously you could only get if you are a Netanyahu confidant, someone very much trusted by the inner circle around Netanyahu. But the question that people are asking is how much independence he'll have. Yes, he may be loyal to Netanyahu, but it remains to be seen whether he will be able to stand up and say different things and give different opinions that may not toe the line of Netanyahu. The opening speech was poured over by Zamir himself, was poured over by commentators looking for areas of independence. Yes, he gave all the right lines. He talked about victory total victory, very much in the line of what Netanyahu has been saying since the beginning of the war. It did also mention the need for enlistment amongst all sectors of the Israeli population without going too much into it. So there is something in there which certainly could demonstrate a certain amount of independence, but he certainly didn't go too far, but that's to be expected, certainly on his first day. But what it does mean, today's events, is that Netanyahu has been able to get rid of the defense minister of October 7th, and now he's been able to get rid of the the IDF chief of staff. The next person in his sights, clearly, is the head of Shin Bet, Ronen Bar. Ronen Bar, for a certain amount of time, is seen as the next in line, is seen as someone who, if you want to be uncharitable, and people who are in the opposition would say, is it just merely another scapegoat for Netanyahu to place all the blame for October 7th on? Netanyahu's people would say that, and correctly, he was part of the circle of failure on October 7th and hasn't really done such a great job since, and deserves to leave. Again, some opposition figures would point to the fact that, just as with going against the judicial system, only seemed to happen when Netanyahu himself was embroiled personally in the judicial system, so too Ronen Bar has gone after some of Netanyahu's closest advisors and what's now being called Qatar Gate, where there is an accusation amongst at least 3 individuals within Netanyahu's close circle, some of the closer circles, spokespeople, advisors, who at one point, it is alleged, was paid money to do services for Qatar, whether directly by the Qatari government or through a third party. The Shin Bet was asked to look into it, and it has looked into it and even passed a file recommending to open case against the individuals, and that's certainly very harmful for Netanyahu. And so those who are opposed to Netanyahu try and draw a line once again between personal attacks and trying to remove people from certain positions. Again, not coincidentally, this week, after the IDF released its report into October 7th and the failings leading up to before the day and the day itself, the Shin Bet did likewise. It was a lot less, let's say, politically neutral than the IDF's report. It found quite a lot of blame, and a lot of it was very implicitly directed at the political level, and perhaps even, or not perhaps, at Netanyahu himself. And this is also part of the ongoing attacks between the two. In the Shin Bet report, obviously, it did accept responsibility. It failed to understand the signals. It failed to understand the intelligence. It didn't have the apparatus and the infrastructure in place. But it also blamed a general conception. That's the big term in Israel since the beginning of the war, the conceptia, the conception. What was the conception? How was it mistaken vis-a-vis Hamas, and what their abilities were? So some, when they talk about the conception, talk about the general military conception, but many others talk about an overall conception coming from the highest political levels and blame Bibi himself for imparting this conception that Hamas can be managed, Hamas can even be an asset, and it should remain where it is. And a part of that is that the Shin Bet blamed the Qatari suitcases, which were very much Netanyahu's policy. If one remembers the so-called protection money of Qatari suitcases going in every month full of cash that would basically end up in Hamas's hands, and was used on October 7th as part of their attack. Another part of what the Shin Bet said was going on that contributed to the attacks was the division of the nation. That's a very implicit attack on Netanyahu. And going even further, attacking Netanyahu from the right is the Shin Bet make the claim, which is denied by Netanyahu, that they wanted to have targeted assassinations of Hamas leadership and take a far more robust and militant course of action against the Hamas leadership, and it was the political level that basically denied these operations. Netanyahu said the opposite is true. He was the one who wanted it, and it was the Shin Bet who vigorously decided otherwise. One can certainly decide who are the decision makers and who are the ones who are supposed to enunciate policy and who are supposed to direct policy, but that is the war of words that is coming. Ronen Bar himself has said that he will resign when two things will happen, which are when the hostages return and when there is a full state inquiry. Full state inquiry is something that Netanyahu has fought against from day one, and the return of all hostages, again, is not happening in the near future. So Ronen Bar, while he said that he will go, it's clear he's not going anytime soon. So Netanyahu, it seems, again, these are reports, is starting to initiate steps to try and remove him from his position. On a similar level, for the first time, finally, after months and months of threatening, the government, Justice Minister Yariv Levin, has initiated a process to officially remove the Attorney General, Gali Barav Miara, who has been a thorn in the side of the government. Again, another scapegoat, another target, another person, if you fall in the Netanyahu camp, someone who's prevented the government, who's held them back from doing what's necessary to defeat their enemies or run a right-wing sort of policy management. We'll have to wait and see exactly how far this goes, because again there are a number of processes that need to go through. But both of these, Ronen Bar is not necessarily favored. Most of Israeli public do believe that he should go. Again, as someone who failed on October 7th, the country is pretty split on Barav Miara. But interestingly enough, according to polls, there is an overwhelming majority, 75%, who believe Netanyahu himself should resign. So, there's quite a lot in there that would suggest by some of Netanyahu's opponents that, to distract and deflect attention from his failings, his personal failings, and the fact that he once again swept away calls from many sectors of the public, from hostage families, from bereaved families, to initiate finally a state commission of inquiry. And so a lot of Israelis are feeling angry about that, and I think that shows in his deep popularity. Finally, we had a bit of a political, potential minor crisis coming up. Housing Minister Goldknopf of the ultra-Orthodox party is threatened to quit. He says he'll quit after the budget votes. There was a vote yesterday to increase or to give over what's called coalition money. It's usually sort of slush funds that are given out to various coalition partners to keep them quiet. There's billions, and let's not forget this is a time of austerity in Israel and everything. Taxes have gone up, etc., etc. So billions have been given not just to Haredi yeshivot, ultra-Orthodox seminaries, but also to organizations which will ensure that their community does not enlist in the army, all the while this government is calling up hundreds of thousands of Israelis who are working, pulling them away from their families. On the other hand, it's basically paying the ultra-Orthodox community not to serve. And this was trying to sweeten to make sure that it's only Goldknopf who leaves. In his party, UTJ, United Torah Judaism, there are two sections. There's the Hasidic and the non-Hasidic. Goldknopf is the leader of the Hasidic party. The non-Hasidic party is not leaving, and the Shas party, the Sephardi ultra-Orthodox party, is not leaving, is not making any murmurs to leave. So Goldknopf leaving the government or leaving his position is a message. It could snowball if some of the other ultra-Orthodox parties are embarrassed that they are not leaving. But at the moment, it's only a mini crisis. But it does seem that Bibi is trying to get all his ducks in a row to pass that all-important budget by the end of the month to ensure the longevity of his cabinet and his coalition. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ashley. Now, I will go to a question from Eric Selkov, who asks, what are your thoughts about the Doha, Egypt plan for Gaza?
I mean, it's a non-starter. There's nothing new in there. You know, the fact that it talks about the PA, it talks about rehabilitation, talks about billions invested. We've heard all this before. I think they even know that it's a non-starter. It was adopted by the Arab League. Now they're trying to get wider support from Islamic states. But the Americans have already shot it down. The Israelis have shot it down. So it's really a non-starter. It doesn't say anything new. It's international peacekeeping forces. It talks about, as I said, bringing the PA in, talks about, you know, international rehabilitation. But basically, Israel will say, and it already has said, that there's absolutely nothing new in here. This is what we've seen before after every round previously. And October 7th has to teach us that there needs to be something different. And that's why Israel is broadly supportive of the Trump plan. And the Americans themselves have said that this is a non-starter. But the Arab parties, it has pushed them to try and come up with something. So at least in that respect, you know, it's positive. But clearly, if these are the contours for their plan, there's absolutely nothing original. There's very little detailed in there, and it's clear that it's not. It's more for public relations. It's to show, yes, we're trying to think outside the box. Yes, we want to stop the Trump plan for voluntary migration, or however you want to see it, for the Trump Rivieras, some have called it. But it's clearly not an overly serious plan at this stage. It's more just about saying that we have other ideas, alternatives to the Trump plan.
Thank you. Now, Barak Korkmaz asks, how likely is it that the prime minister will resign? And if he does, who will lead the Likud party in his place?
Well, first of all, it's very unlikely. Everything that Netanyahu is doing is showing that he's not interested in resigning, has no intention of resigning, and making sure that any attempts to even push towards that are just, you know, shooed away. So it's kind of the second part is a bit of a moot question because there is no obvious successor, and that's part of Netanyahu ensures that there is no obvious person who is sitting just in the wings waiting to take over. Even the sort of the potential heir apparent, Nir Barkat, had a bit of a bad week because he earlier in the week there was a very, very powerful interview with one of the released hostages who was only found out when he was released about his daughter and children were murdered. And it was a harrowing tale. I don't know the exact viewing figures, but I'd say there's very, very few Israelis who didn't see it and were not affected by it. He really went into very, very specific details. And when a reporter during an interview asked Nir Barkat if he had watched it himself, he said, no, I had better things to do, which obviously one can imagine did not come out well. So he certainly lost a bit of his sheen this week. But there's no obvious person in Likud who could take over from Netanyahu, and there are no plans to do so, especially not at this point. Likud does not replace its leader during the term, and they're very much still openly, publicly rallying around Netanyahu, even if when you push a little bit further behind closed doors, there are quite a number of people, even senior people in the Likud, who are saying that Netanyahu's time is up, but you won't hear any of that publicly.
Great, thank you. Now, I'll go to a question from David Levine, who asks, reading between the lines of President Trump sending the bombs to Israel and saying he respects their right to defend Israel's right to defend itself, as well as Iran appearing exceptionally vulnerable, is there an expectation in Israel that Tehran will be bombed soon?
A lot of experts in Israel are saying that this is the greatest opportunity and window that Israel has had and may have. At the moment, they are leaving some room for President Trump's wish to negotiate to see if maximum pressure will bring them back to the table. At the moment, it's not. In fact, they're going the other direction. I think the Ayatollah fired one of his main advisors, who was one of the faces of so-called moderation and negotiations for the JCPOA. And so it's clear that Iran is suffering, but they are making no moves towards the negotiating table. Israel will almost certainly want a clock on this. They'll want to know, how long specifically do we give it? Because there is a concern that Iran could rearm, could maybe get from Russia. There's an interesting dynamic now where Russia has said that it's prepared to mediate between America and Iran. But Israel certainly feels that there's a lot of people in Israel feel that there is this opportunity. There are some who say, well, they want the new chief of staff, El Zamir, to get into office, to get caught up, even though he was a very senior position as Defense Ministry Director General. So it's not that he was out of the loop, but really to get him in, to get the plans together, whatever they may be. But we'll have to wait and see. It's clear that they haven't got the green light yet. They haven't been given the biggest bunker busters that America has, but certainly they have been sent some of the munitions, the more heavy munitions that the Biden administration held up. So everything really is in place from Israel's point of view. First of all, there has to be a green light from the Trump administration. Also, there has to be a will from the Israeli political leadership. But certainly a lot of people in Israel saying that this is the time.
All right, thank you. Now, there has been recent reports that the IDF has eliminated a top Hamas commander in the West Bank. And one of the things we hear a lot from adversaries of Israel is that there is no Hamas in the West Bank. What is their presence currently like in Judea and Samaria?
I've never heard anyone say that Hamas doesn't have any presence in Judea and Samaria and the West Bank. That would be absurd. But I've heard a lot more absurd things over the last 60 months, so I can imagine. Hamas are strong. It varies from city to city. Sometimes Fatah have more power, sometimes Islamic Jihad, sometimes just independent groups. Israel is trying to sweep through some of the more problematic areas in Judea and Samaria, in Jenin, in Tulkarem, into what some called the sort of viper's nests, especially in the refugee camps, clearing away, trying to get to the infrastructure of Hamas and some of these other terrorist groups. But certainly Hamas have a very strong presence. Let's not forget, Hamas didn't exist, then they certainly won quite a popularity in elections a number of years. Well, it's actually quite a lot of years ago, because Mahmoud Abbas hasn't allowed any elections ever since. I think it was 2005, if I remember correctly. No, Hamas very much has a presence in Judea and Samaria and the West Bank, a very strong presence. And in fact, there's clashes between them and Fatah on an almost daily basis. They both, to a certain extent, fight Israel, and they both fight each other. So it would be quite absurd to say that Hamas has no presence. Some of the terror attacks that we've seen in Israel recently come from people affiliated with Hamas.
All right, thank you very much. Ken Abramowitz would like to ask, what percent of the population think that the Supreme Court bears the primary responsibility for October 7th?
Basically, a relatively small subsection who believe very much in Netanyahu's narrative. It's a very hard case to make. That even during the war, the Supreme Court didn't really tie Israel's arms. There's very, very few cases, I'm not sure of any offhand, where it tied Israel's hands on anything to do with the war and how it conducted the war. And it's a very hard case to make that it was the Supreme Court that allowed the conception that Hamas are contained. It's very hard to make the case that the Supreme Court pushed Netanyahu to give Qatari suitcases of cash to Hamas every single month, allowing itself to arm itself and prepare the way for October 7th. So there are a few people who are buying into that narrative that perhaps the sort of left-wing Supreme Court with others brought about October 7th. But A, that's not what Hamas say. B, that's not what anybody really says looking at it. It was a lot of failures. If you look at the Shin Bet report, as I said, as well as accounting for their own failures, they look at the fact that Netanyahu was too dovish on many issues. A lot of people feel, again, especially those who would blame the Supreme Court, that they don't allow Netanyahu to be hawkish, whereas some would actually accuse Netanyahu of being far too dovish, allowing Hamas too much, giving Hamas too much, even thinking of them as an asset. There's quite a lot of people in Israel who criticize Netanyahu for claiming that Hamas have been an asset in splitting the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, and Gaza, allowing Fatah in one area and Hamas in another to ensure that there will be no Palestinian states. That Netanyahu even said this a few times, and certainly people around him. And a lot of people are pointing to that Hamas as an asset attitude, which led directly to October 7th. So it's practically speaking, logically speaking, factually speaking, it's a very hard case to make that the Supreme Court led to October 7th.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Ashley. I'm afraid that is all the time we have for this week's podcast. I want to thank you again for taking the time to give us an update this week.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Of course. Now, for our viewers and listeners, please be on the lookout over the weekend in your email inboxes for our weekly podcast offerings for next week. As always, I thank you all again for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks.